2 years in the making. It's I think myself and Aina, who is on after me, who is far more entertaining than I will ever be. We were just saying that it's trying to remember even what notes we wrote 2 years ago and what has changed in the meantime. It's quite a funny one for me to be standing up here, because ultimately a text message that I sent to a very good friend of mine who is a civil engineer, and we spoke about biodiversity, climate change, we spoke about schools, gardens, and I know there is one near enough to me in North County Dublin, which has a giant-sized area of grass, which is ultimately does not photosynthesize, let's call it that. And we were trying to say, how do you make that change when ultimately it starts with the builder and it starts with the developer? And that is where it is at this moment in time. And I'll try and keep this upbeat, and I will get to the upbeat moments. But it's worthwhile noting that until that dynamic changes at the very top of the page, which is from architect to builder-developer, builder-developer appoints a landscape architect is handed a space that is freely available, and ultimately you end up what we can only describe in a school, in a development, in a housing estate, in a new block of apartments. It doesn't really matter. You end up with the space that is available, and they are left with that to fill in as plants. They are the gardens that we would ultimately step away from, or Peter Donegan Garden Design as a practice would step away from, because we can't change them. We've got 3 golden rules. As a business, are they good people? Will it be a nice garden? And the one I sometimes forget, will we make money? And that is where it leaves us. So when we speak across the water on the big island, as I would refer to it, it's a total different dynamic. SUDS, or sustainable drainage, is in place. It's live, it's happening. There's street planting, the retention of water below ground. It is all in place, and it is going to become one of them. But it's worth noting where we are, I guess, as a country, if we then take what is history and we go backtrack from where we were to where we are now. My apologies, and I just got some notes. The understanding of what biodiversity is, and I'm going to give you, this is information that was given to me when I asked friends of mine. So those who are, all of my mates are engineers, architects. So biodiversity, by definition, is a wide variety of plants and animals in their natural environment. That is their understanding of it. And when I asked one, he sent me the Collins English Dictionary definition of it. A second one gave me the degree of variation of life forms within a given ecosystem. I asked, what or how do we become more biodiverse? Plant a native tree, put up a bird box, install a rainwater harvester, water lawns and plants at night time. These are all a list of things that will be handed to us as a design practice, and we're then asked to make the change, but the space is already in place, if that makes sense. However, what we try and do is put the infrastructure in place so that you don't need the bird boxes and so you don't need the insect hotels. The conversation we had before we came here this morning, myself and Chloe Quinn, who works very closely with me, my apologies, is that if you have a apartment balcony, if you have a house that you're renting and it's got, for example, fake plastic grass in it and it's all paved in, you and your son or you and your daughter putting in an insect or bug hotel is something, because at least you're giving them an education. It's not, there's no frown upon that. But you'll start to see when I show you gardens that we do and what we try and do with them, how we make it look like the garden is of eloquence, or it is something that is attractive to you, it is something that you want to be in. And the bit that we don't go kicking and screaming about is the fact that we've made a biodiverse garden, because ultimately when we consider, or when other people hand us the remit of what they would want, it's a collection of Pinterest board images. And those Pinterest board images are invariably bug hotels, insect hotels, rainwater harvesters, and all of those things within it. And we try and hide those. So I'll skip on to If I can, let me see, I've got this. So this is one of the gardens that we took on in 2018. This is Chateau de Peronne. It is in northern France. It was to mark the centenary of the ending of World War I. I was one of 14 designers selected globally to design in historic locations. By default, I therefore represented Ireland. To quote my dear dad, when I told him a French jury selected me, he said an Irish jury wouldn't have done so. This, however, is what we turned it into. So what you're looking at here, the photograph on the right-hand side is this side here. And the director of the castle had said to me, when you look through the arches to the far side, the only thing he said to me was, the only people who go in there are people with their dogs because they have business to conduct. So we flick it now to how do you bring people into a garden, bearing in mind this castle had fallen in the Franco-Prussian War, the First World War, the Second World War. We needed to make things look old, number one. Number two, it's 30 foot below street level. And number three, what's worth noting in here, and this is the bit that we don't tell because the castle ultimately is the backdrop, so it doesn't matter what we're going to do, biodiversity is never the tail that will make it to the top of the page. Whilst we're at this conference, it now becomes specific, maybe more so to that. But if I flick across, what you actually see is, number one, there are no water facilities in the dried up moat. Number two, there are specific points where we were allowed to dig down, invariably because they were afraid that we would find bodies beneath the ground, and we know they're still there. But number three, the biggest part was, how do you bring somebody into a disused part of the garden that nobody wants to go into apart from somebody and their dog? If you look at the benches on the left-hand side, or these tables, it's very, very simple what we've done here. The children would come and they were told about all of the history of the castle. We needed a place where they could come, where people could smile, where they could look to the future, where they could remember the past, which is one element of it. But the second part of it is they're now doing tours of this garden. And that to me is extremely fascinating. But one of the things that we've got in here, if you think about it, if we're sitting outside this beautiful hotel that we're in now, on a sunny day, and you're having a pint bottle of your favorite, let's call it orange drink or other, you might have a canopy umbrella overhead. In this place, when we first arrived in 2017, excuse me, the grass was scorched to an absolute cinder. And if you've got Irish red hair, which three of my sisters do, then you'll be used to seeing them get extremely sunburnt. So we've made shading with the trees that are to the left, in between the tables, number one. Number two, they're free draining. Number three, the timber is all locally sourced. There's no soil removal. When I flick again between one and the other, there is no soil removed from any of this garden at all. I could turn around and say to you, the proverbial comment that's always made is that there is no chemicals used in this garden whatsoever. All of the plants were sourced locally. All of the timber sourced locally. The contractors were sourced locally. And by sole virtue of not removing soil from this garden and clever design, and I'll go back and say this, in all of the gardens you're about to see, you'll find a common denominator between them all, is that the thought process behind is that we make a garden extremely attractive, number one, so that you want to go in. You're wooed into the garden. It's the first part, and it's hugely important. It doesn't need to be at all times, and I double underline this, there's nothing wrong with any of this, but in this case, we have to reflect the client. The client has to turn around and say that they're happy with this. That, in my head, as a guy who used to grow plants under his bed when I was 6 years of age, who knew what phototropism was age 7, I did my first garden age 9. We're in business since 2001, which makes me a little bit older, post 4 years studying horticulture. It doesn't matter what we do, whether it's on television or not. I can say it to you, and this is the first conversation about it. Every single one of them has, at the top of the page, it has to be attractive. And in the top right-hand corner, there's a part of it where we have to turn around and be able to sleep better at night time, if I may, with a biodiversity climate change part in place. To go back, and I will go full circle on all of this, I promise you. When I go back and we look at what's happening between building architect in schools, supermarkets, etc., it can become a bit frustrating, but that's the part that I can't change. What you can do is we can turn around and say, well, here's what we are able to do, here's what we have done, and now we can put it up on a stage and we can use this as the focal point. So now I'm not here to, as such, lecture anybody or say you've got it wrong. And again, I'll reference the fake grass meets bug hotel. There's nothing wrong with that. But in this case, we're just saying, well, this is what we've chosen to do. And this is how we chose to do it. I'll flick on to the next one. So this is phase 2. And this is the garden that is due for inauguration. The last garden was inaugurated 2019. And this one is due for inauguration June 25th, if any of you happen to be in northern France, in Peronne, a town where they don't serve Guinness, I should add, but that's neither here nor there. When in Rome, you say. And this garden is a little bit interesting because it's the Courtyard Garden, and we inherit, again, elements of it left over. So what I say here is we inherit an entire courtyard filled with concrete, but it's a 13th century castle, so that's okay. But at the same token, when I reference a school or a building or an institution that's just had its new building done, there's nothing different between what is 13th century in this case and what is now the year 2022. It's all the same. History tends to repeat, and our job is to try and make the most out of that. If you start to hone in on what is the H and what is actually a full-size Panzer tank up against a 13th century wall, the planting around that is, funnily enough, made from the raised planters, my apologies, are made from a product called Medite trichoia. Medite trichoia, for those who are not aware, is an Irish-made product, funnily enough made by our Irish forestry company Quilcha. It's like MDF, but it's got a 25-year guarantee below water, a 50-year guarantee above. So sustainability is very much in mind. If you put it on a compost heap, it'd be there for 50 years or 25 years is the point I'm making this. Compost, we've spec'd peat-free. Planting is all sourced locally. The contractor is sourced locally. We've got birch trees in, not because I'm a fan of what German discount superstores have decided to plant outside their shops, but because they represent, in this case, peace. And it was huge that we got this in. To slightly go off kilter on this one, what we have predominantly in here, and I was discussing with one of your colleagues here with us this evening, or this morning, is a lot of plants that evoke memory. They're all of scent, they're all of, and it's funny when you get speaking about elements of this, it's of perfume that maybe your mom would have wore, say 50, 40, 30, your wife would have wore 30 years ago. And once you get it, that scent, it brings you all the way back to where you were when you were a child, when you first got it. The point I'm making this is that when you look at this, it doesn't matter whether we go to the garden before at the front and you go, my God, it's a 13th century castle. It looks amazing, these giant sized columns. The bit behind the curtains is the bit that has or that makes me and Chloe, my esteemed colleague, sleep very well in what we're doing. We know we're doing the right thing. We just don't get to shout about it until we get invited to speak at a wonderful event like this, where we are now. In this one here, it's the same thing again. You have to woo people into a place. You need to make them stay longer. And once you do that, then the bits behind the scenes may come into conversation, and then you start to get to be able to brag about yourself. This garden will be pieced together in about 8 days' time. We've a lot of steel going in to this, for which we will then attach the Medite trichoia to. And in steel, and one of the conversations we got into, myself and Chloe, of recent, is a thing called net biodiversity. To put net biodiversity into context, and you're about to see this come up again, so I'll explain as best I can now in its simplest format. Net biodiversity basically says if we can enhance a space by using something like steel, which may be put on the mildly controversial list, because obviously driving to here, even this morning, you're in a diesel car, we're not all in electrics, let's be honest about it. Our coffee beans have come in from somewhere else, etc., the list goes on. We can never be, inverted commas, carbon neutral, and even though I might decide to pay off my credits, it doesn't change anything. I've still driven here this morning. In this case here, the use of steel enhances the garden, the longevity of the plants. There are no bedding plants, there are no wildflower seeds, there are no machinery required to come back in and replace this. And whilst we're on that note, if we look at what councils are now doing and where trends are now going, if you take bedding plants, which councils used to use, they then went to wildflower seeds, and now they're gone to, inverted commas, wildflower bulbs, which is a horticultural misnomer. It doesn't really exist. But the logic in it is that the bulbs come up every single year and you mow straight across the grass, and we're back at the far side. This here that you're looking at is the technical, it's the equation at all times behind the daydream. It might not mean a whole lot, or it may look a little bit complicated, but this might clarify it just a little bit better. At all times, again, I'll say it, we close our eyes, you listen to Dire Straits sing Romeo and Juliet, if I may. Nobody ever sat down with Mark Knopfler or their band and said, how did you come up with that chord? Well, it took me actually 5 weeks to do so. You hear the song, you fall in love, and that is the way it should work. After that, you get to then peel behind the curtains. So when we get to this part of it here, what we've actually, and what you're looking at here, you'll see the cross in the middle of it, almost like a Bridget's cross, if I may. And that is a reed bed system, but what we've taken is loose equation from what you would know better as Japanese gardens. And Japanese gardens operate on two colours. If you've ever been to Old Highbury Stadium or the Emirates, Arsenal fan, then you will get where I'm coming from. Red against green always bounces. Japanese gardens are based loosely on Little Red Riding Hood, which is danger, don't go down here. You've got a road or a pathway that you can see heading straight away on. The planting becomes bland, it fades into the background, and it serves only a purpose to highlight the red. Red against green bounces, and we're back to it again. It's sexy, eloquent, beautiful gardens that woo you in. If you don't have that, it doesn't matter how biodiverse or how beautiful your garden is. You can show me pictures of wildflower. I can see a million of them on Instagram. But at some point in time, you're going to have to cut this, and now it doesn't look as endearing, if I may. At all times, the infrastructure does this. It makes you want to come back. If you take Teepval, which is designed by Edwin Lutyens, he would have designed the private gardens in Lambay Island. He would have designed the War Memorial Gardens at Nyland Bridge. What most people would remember these for is the infrastructure. The planting, not to be disrespectful to the subject I studied, which was horticulture, but that becomes almost secondary. It becomes the backdrop, but at all times, doesn't matter what season, the building changes, the dappling of light against it changes. There's consistently a woo into the outdoor space. And once you nail that part, it doesn't matter how big your garden is, and you're about to see this in a little bit as we progress through, once you nail this part of it, that bit that always looks like a daydream, then you consistently have a garden that people want to speak about, they want to talk about, and once you get into that, then you become up on this podium here and you get to say, well, let me show you behind the curtains, let me show you how you make this happen. If we take this one, reed bed system is just that. We could have done what most people do with their biocycle, which is put a pot plant on top of it, and you can drive through the back roads of North County Dublin and you can tell who's got a biocycle in their front garden because it's predominantly a lawn with a rhododendron sitting on top of it in a ceramic pot or a plastic pot. We all know that, we're all aware of them, but that bridge is painted red. It's designed so that you walk off the back of the house onto this red bridge and you do what happens in 17th century estates or 17th century gardens. 17th century gardens in a nutshell, our second award. Our first award was for the design and build of a 55-acre 18th century estate. Our second award was for a 27-acre 17th century estate. This makes me sound very, very good, but ultimately when you get into those designs, what you realize is it sounds great. The building is a mammoth. It's the type of place where you would walk in and immediately your wife-to-be would say, this is the one. We're getting married here. It's that type of place that you would fall in love with, but it's very, very logic because it takes the building, which is predominantly of symmetry, front door, out the back door, and once you walk onto the patio at the back, you've got a crisscross off. You see the bridge, the way we have it done like the Bridget's Cross, it's the same thing, it's the same principles that you're following, which now join into what we would know as Japanese gardens. When you follow off the back of this, the idea is you're not supposed to get to where you want to go. To go back to 17th century, if you follow that symmetry to the very, very back of the house, the only thing you're meant to do when you get there is to sit on a bench and look back up at the grandeur of your house. But you're never meant to get there, you're meant to get lost. When we follow off of this and you go up to top left-hand corner, no, not top left, bottom right-hand corner as you're looking at it now, they had an overgrown garden. This is a young family that have moved in. They've got 3, 4 children, husband and wife, was previously owned by a lady who was nutty, inverted commas, for all of the quirky and beautiful reasons about nature. But I can't expect a husband and wife with 4 children to come in and have that amount of time to give to a garden. So they've got 2 jobs each. They both work hard. They love and adore that space. But when we take it, we didn't want to remove all of the trees, but we couldn't leave it as it was. So we've taken we've gone with the triplicate of burning red Japanese gardens where one path goes straight on and you catch a glimpse of one reappearing, disappears and reappears again. And in this one, what we've actually done is we've gone, let me go back to here. This is what you're looking at now. You've got a approximate 3.5, 4 meter, if you picture the height of the ceiling here, and you're now walking up a staircase into the tree canopy the whole way around. And to get off of that giant-sized tree canopy, you then go to this part again, and you'll see a line coming from bottom right-hand corner over to what is number 9 here. That's a zip line that goes all the way off and brings you down to what is a 2-story children's treehouse. From there, you then lead on to what is an outdoor cinema. And there's nothing new in this. This isn't rocket science. We all have a DVD player. Everybody's been on a zip wire. You pay to bring your children there. Zip wires aren't expensive. This all sounds genius. I sound like sure, why wouldn't you run away with me in the morning when I say these things? But zip wires and steel in the air are nothing new. This has been around since time began. There are 3 stories in the memorial in Thiepval, which was built in the 1940s out of stone. And that is nothing but a large Arc de Triomphe, if I may-esque structure sat within a landscape, a town where it's got a population of about 100 people. There's nothing else there, but everybody reveres this thing. So when we bring it back down to a private garden, 2 acres, why can't you have it? And the answer is, ultimately, what will happen in most gardens that we will not take on is you will turn around to the woman of your dreams, or the man of your dreams, if I may, and you will walk out your back garden, and it will be a sheet of €40 fencing from B&Q, not to be disrespectful to you. There'll be a €640 shed in the bottom right-hand corner and a washing line, and somewhere near to that you may decide to put in a raised bed, usually built out of railway sleepers. It doesn't make sense to me, because washing lines, to quote my dear dad, sheds and gardening, if you are of anywhere around the 80s, you made your children, quote unquote, you made them go out and cut the grass. You made them turn over the soil. You made them go out and dig the garden, and it's not meant to be that. When you take a place that is of eloquence and it endears people out, it changes that whole psyche behind the scenes, and now it becomes not of work. I'll scroll on to this one, and this is again, bearing in mind everything that I've said so far. This is the designs that we had done for DIY SOS in leak slip. You'll remember it better as this photograph, and what you see here is a rocket ship. What stole the show, not my intention, was that we took a rocket ship 3.5 meters tall, we brought in a 130-ton tower crane, and we craned it over the house. The point of the rocket ship wasn't the rocket ship. The point of the rocket ship was that if you actually get into the rocket ship, which is, let's call it a glorified treehouse. I'm now showing you behind the curtains. Half of me wants to do this, the little child in me doesn't. You should be able to hear Solomon Burke and just see only that. In this case, when you crawl up into the bottom of it and you go inside, there's a hatch at the top. It's a bird hide. It's not meant to be a rocket ship, but everybody sees that. But it's just not made of, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm being facetious here, it's just not made of tea tree pea oil and twigs. It doesn't look like a photograph of what we would consider, inverted commas, wildflower verges, but it contains everything in it. We have the logs, we had the bird feeders. Again, if you look at the bird feeders, they were handmade for us by a guy who had some leftover timber, but I told him I wanted them as Chelsea Flower Show standard, and he did exactly that. The timber was locally sourced. Everything in there. The only thing that made me smile in all of this was that if you look at it, we've got a serpentine walkway. And the only other serpentine walkway I know of is in the middle of Dublin Castle, where you'll see the children run around like absolute kids, which is what they're meant to do. So the distractions are along the way, they're all there, but ultimately the question is it a good-looking garden? Yes. Where does the water drain to? To the beds on the outside. Have you got a lawn in? Is there fake grass in there? No. Everything drains on itself. The infrastructure is in there. All of those trees are brand spanking new. We crane them, no, we carried them through the house because we've got a phone call at 6:30 in the morning saying we actually have them for you. There's nothing in here that's I say this loosely, but nothing in here is rocket science. The principles behind all of the gardens are the same. And gardens without equations are make it up as you go along. They can only be that. And when you do a make it up as you go along, you end up with a garden that is reticent of my dad. And my dad was terrible at anything that photosynthesized. It either died or wanted to die very, very quickly. We scroll on past and we get to what you would know as the garden in, is this Centenary? It is. So the big building Centenary was the one that was on just recently. It's probably the tightest space we've ever worked on, I would say in my 20-something years, certainly under my own name. I would have done rooftop gardens on top of multi-story car parks when I was 17 years of age, and I was cutting my teeth in the industry. But this, I wanted to show you this as an overview, Chloe's drawing of what type of space we're dealing with. This is number one, top of the remit page here is wheelchair accessibility. And if you know the story, if not, I'm sure it's on RTE Player or one of them, or you'll catch the video online. But when you look at where the car is, that's front garden, so ramp access up. The objective there again was it does all of the things that we needed to do, which is drain on its own soil, try and bring nature in, try and bring scent in. We were restricted on what pollen we could, plants that produce large amounts of pollen went in there. At the same token, when we scroll on, you'll start to get to see where the equations start to come in through. So we have this space which is approximately, let's say, 2 of the tables pieced together, not much bigger than that. And we needed, again, distraction upon distraction at all times. That's the way that the daydream operates first, and then you go backwards and you start to see the equation again. When you get to this side of it, what we wanted to do was to make a space where the dog used to sit in a trampoline, number one. Number two, we wanted to make it so that mom could go outside and spend time. And I'll go back and say that again. When a mom wants to go out and spend time with her children, albeit there are, if I may politely say, restrictions in her abilities, to want to go outside is the operative key. When we speak about schools, car parks, hotels you want to get married in, there are places where you would close your eyes and go, that is the one. There are places where you won't go. There are parks where you adore them. There are parks that have historic, predominantly buildings, and therefore they come to the expansive land around it. When we speak about gardens where you wouldn't want to go out to, I'll reference the twirly washing line, the shed, possibly a trampoline, something along the lines of your garden is predominantly 8 meters by 10 meters. I can tell you this because of the amount of panels with a concrete H-post between each line. You've normally got 6 of them, and that tells me it's 1.8 meters multiplied by 6. It's as simple as. There's nothing that's going to endear me outside. I say me, there's nothing going to endear me outside. We can do the add-on bit, but the equation is what it comes back to. In this case, we decided to do this instead, and this is a cantilevered structure. The cantilever structures, again, no rocket science here as far as I would be concerned, but at the same token, when we look at this part of the equation, we have trees in a space that is the size of both tables. 2 tables pieced together, and we've managed to get 3 trees in here. If you look at the planting around the outside, what you're not looking at is that the paving doesn't meet the edges of the walls. We haven't paved in the entire of the garden. The water can free drain away both sides. The planting is in there, and you're seeing the planting, and you're seeing the eloquence, and you're seeing the things that are beautiful, but the bit behind the scenes is the biodiversity, the climate change. It's locally sourced plants. All of those plants were sourced in Ireland. All of them came from Glanbia garden centres. All of the compost, the growing medium, if I may, was recycled soil. All again sourced locally. All of the stone was sourced locally. The timber was sourced locally. The steel structure now allows us to bring trees in, but if we turn around to anybody as a design practice, a garden design practice, and say, thank you for your money, we're now putting 3 trees into your garden, which is the size of these 2 tables, we will be told straight up, it's not happening. But when we put it inside a, guess what, red structure, bring the trees up through the table, and bring the trees then up through the structure again, Everybody says, oh my God, what a feat of engineering. How did he manage to do that? Because we've made this distraction happen all over. The beauty and what you're now seeing at this moment in time is we then took a sheet of Medai trichoia, we've mentioned this before, wood that works outside, painted it a different colour, bolted it to the wall, and put a cinema screen on. So when you come around the corner, you see the red and the trees going up through, and when you turn the corner, what you see is this. What you don't see in here, if I may reference it, is there is no off-the-shelf furniture, so we don't have one chair missing. So when Mom comes around the corner, that's not where she is supposed to sit, which reminds me loosely of my grandmother when she came around at Christmas time, and she hated it. This is the other side of what you see. We've then decided to put sedum up on top of the roof. So we now have ultimately the square meterage that is below that stoned in. The bit that makes me sleep well is that we've given that bit back. It just can't be seen from the ground level. So do we sleep well? We sleep extremely well at night time, knowing that this is what we've managed to piece together. But this is not a television program about Peter Donegan and how amazing he is, albeit you might think that, and I understand why, pardon my wry sense of humor, but at the same token, the bit behind the scenes is I guess, goes back to me as a 6-year-old kid growing plants under my bed, when I was sieving soil, when I was planting my seeds in 2-foot trenches, because I read a book called An Easy Guide to Gardening that I bought for 50 pence at a book sale, written by a guy called H.H. Thomas. An Easy Guide to Gardening, and his opening line was, start by digging the ground 2 foot deep. And so I did. And that didn't work out too well. So at 7 years of age, you learn very quickly how to identify weed seeds by their opening leaves, which is not what the intention was, and one thing leads to another, and now I'm here in front of you. If we flick on to this one, this is the new Ross episode. It's very easy to show me these, for me to show you these gardens. I mean, we thought, myself and Chloe spoke in depth about this, of what gardens we should show, because I'm not used to, as one of 8 children, saying how great I am. It's not something that sits very well with me. I think it's a very humble position to be placed into, to be allowed to daydream, but to be able to back that up. And in backing it up, you need equations when you're going at timelines like this to put the stats in on this garden. This is, again, Johnny from New Ross. I was talking to him about 3 weeks ago. Johnny and Lynn's garden in New Ross was just under an acre. They had 10 days to build a house. We had 8 days to build a garden. 2,050 square meters of lawn, 350 square meters of paving, 365 square meters of planting. The list is absolutely endless. 176 linear meters of curbing. Numbers are just out of this world. It's not a challenge to go and do this for me. It's just a colossus of numbers and knowing how to manage this. Again, if you follow what I was saying to you earlier on about 17th century estates, you'll start to see press repeat. And I would always say to the horticulture students when I'm speaking to them abroad, be careful of finding out what's behind the curtains. If you find out the equation for falling in love, it doesn't make sense anymore. In this one here, we had to take a skewway of the 17th century sort of straight line off the perpendicular, if that makes sense. We couldn't follow this. So when we look at this one, we've got a 37.5 linear meter long pathway. I think there's a YouTube video of the lighting, which my brief to the electrician was, I want you to make it Billie Jean, Michael Jackson. So as you walked every 3 paces, a light came on in front of you. I'm not going to play that for you now, but you'll remember it probably better for this, which is the full-size grand piano. It's a 1.35:1 Steinway grand piano that we made. We built that out of Core 10 steel. So Core 10, to put this in context, it comes in as black. They obviously don't sell hydrochloric acid off the shelf anymore like they used to in the old days. So we used vinegar, acetic acid and salt as an abrasive. We had 2 days to fast track this rusting. And then we used hydrogen peroxide, which you would know better, or I would know better, as the reason why my sisters have blonde hair. And so that fast tracked that. We also had 35 degrees Celsius heat, so it wouldn't go rusted. The reason we wanted to rust is because, it only rusts on the outer elements of it, is because the vales of the hills in New Ross, where it sits, we wanted it to fade into the background. The focal point isn't the focal point, if you get me. It's a get around the corner. And again, what I spoke to you when you saw New Ross with the cinema, you see a distraction, you see another distraction. It's really quite simple when you get into it, but once you understand the equation, you now understand better why gardens do and don't work. And whilst I show you these gardens, I will also turn around and say whether it's Santry on a tiny space, really size of 2 tables, or whether it's under an acre, the equation to why it works, biodiverse, climate change, locally sourced, the soil, the planting. The planting, when you look at it, and people will say to me, it's like show garden planting, it's that intense. It's not. The growth rates per annum of the planting is taken into consideration. It's planted tighter together. You've got 5 factors required for the growth of any plant. One of them is light. If you eliminate light or reduce it by 95%, it's how we slow down plants from coming into flower, or how we make plants think they're going to die and we fool them into reproduction so we have them in flower. Again, if you understand this equation, you've now got what you would pay money for, which is a bark mulch or a plastic sheeting with a stone on top of it, which, if you are a nettle or along those lines, you will still find a way to germinate through the top of that plastic. The cleverness in the investment behind the scenes is hugely important, but invariably we're back to, I'm going full circle again, what happens when a building development, be it a school, supermarket or other, goes for tender and the landscaper is appointed. Who is the cheapest? It's not who is the clever design. It's not how do we protect the next bit over. It's not maintenance costs. Maintenance costs in Airside Retail Park, not to name them for a disrespectful reason or any way, it was built of an era. And it becomes, you come in with a hedge cutter once every 6 months. You mow the whole thing down, throw it into the back of a truck and it's gone. We're of the opposite. If it grows 1 inch per annum, then it takes longer to have a saleable plant, therefore it costs a little bit more. How do we get clever with this money? We've never had a garden in the last 20 years go over budget or not come in on time, and DIY is probably about the only testament to that you and I would be both aware of. In this case, this grand piano, let me bring this to you in this context. When we speak about sexy, attractive, endearing, that want to go down a 37.5 metre garden, that's basically here to the end of the room in a nutshell. Why would I want to go down if at the bottom of it was a shed and a twirly washing line? The place my mother hated going the most as one of 8 children, you'll appreciate why. But when we put a grand piano there and we plant the top with herbs and fruit bushes and we put 1 continuous line of poetry and some lighting underneath it, everybody thinks it's amazing. And they all want to go down and sit by this area where there's a barbecue built in underneath the lid of the piano. To me, there's nothing new, but then you're talking about a guy who's got imaginary people in his head. I'm just taller now. Most of the times you would have seen me in shorts, not because I wanted to wear shorts, but because it made my daughter giggle. And if it makes you smile, then what's wrong with that? But in this case, there's no difference here between a raised bed made of steel and a raised bed made of wood. The difference between this is when the plants are all cut back, that piano still looks sexy. And now you're back to what Lutyens had done in Thiepval, if I may. The infrastructure is what it comes ultimately full circle to. As a, by the way, that's a tree house in the bottom left or top left hand, your left hand corner glowing in. It's a 5-sided tree house, so we've got glass sort of looking at the bottom, but it's actually built into what will grow up to be a forest of apple trees. And if you're like me, the 2 Brammy apple trees that you had at the back garden were something you tied your brother to and wagered him his dinner to see if you could get back out of it again. We'll go on through here and you'll start to see it in the daylight. And ultimately, again, if you take the amount of planting that we've put into here, the maintenance on this, we had it calculated at about 30 minutes per week. Outside of grass cutting, and grass cutting was specified with a robotic lawnmower, number 1. But number 2, if the planting gets 30 minutes per week, this is where the cost saving comes in. The question I'll go back and say is, will any developer, I'm not blaming developers, we can only do what we can do as a design practice. The question is, will other people turn around and go, that's pretty sexy what they're doing over there, or we like that style of thinking, we like the cut of your jib, would you come and do this with us before that process kicks off? And invariably it's no. Invariably, let's be honest about it, whether you spend 20 grand, 10 grand or 5 grand on a wedding dress, a pair of shoes or your new garden, comes down to how much do you have in your bank account. Go on, this is one that we've done and I've about 4 minutes left here. So this is a car park, but it's a car park with a difference. And it's important that you see what is not ideally known as, inverted commas, sexy. But again, I'll fast track on through this, you've got all of the things that we need to show you, which you would know better as what's going to be Roadstone's retail park in Kingswood in Tala. Their water filtration system, as by the way, is what they use for filtering what they cut their stone with. It's fascinating. You'll find that information online. So in between here, it's one of the first gardens where we've actually included bird boxes. Number one, a lot of this is Chloe's work, I should add, but bird boxes with different sized holes, bat boxes. The trees to tree species, everything we have, the free draining, it's all of those things. We've a whole permaculture, or Chloe has, my apologies, a whole permaculture plan behind the scenes of recommendations to go in on this garden and the biodiversity and climate change, where we've taken it all into consideration. We don't want it to be just a car park. We wanted it to be a park where you could park cars, if that makes sense. But obviously it has to reflect what the stone company is doing. It's not the best one I could have shown you, if I'm very, very honest with you. This one here, so what you're looking at here, these series of lines, this is a 3-story steel structure. We're back to sexy again. You can see the side elevations here. Again, equations behind the scenes, and this is probably the better way to do this. This is a garden. None of these trees exist in this garden as it stands at this moment in time. And what we have, if you look at the first black box with the glass roof, this is the area where you'd walk out for a cup of tea for 2 people. You then walk down and up a set of steps, and you come in underneath the structure. You go all the way through. You're now actually walking, if I may, picture a Japanese garden. I'm back to that again. It's not that we base them solely on that. It's just they're very easy to understand. All the way around, come down to the bottom, and you come up through what is the middle set of steps, and then you go up to the second tier. Again, I'll double underline it. This is a private garden. It's a flat piece of grass as it stands at this moment in time. In all of this, everything free drains on its own. In all of this, we have brought all of the trees in. In all of this, the trees will be probably somewhere around about 30-35 centimetre girth, which means they're at full height. When we bring in a 3-metre steel structure then and map it around the whole of the garden, we now have a place where ultimately what their initial request was, how do we sit out the back with a place where we can listen to nature? How do we have that closer to us? And the question became, well, how do I make you want to go out into the garden even if I give you 1 million trees? How do I make you want to walk through a woodland? Some people drive up the Wicklow Mountains and go into the woodlands, and I'll see them doing this on Instagram. It's phenomenal. But in your own private garden, whether it's the garden in Centenary, which is, again, the size of 2 tables, whether it's 2 acres and it's a grand piano, or whether it's this private garden, which is probably about 1/4 of an acre, how do I make you want to spend more time outside? And ultimately, if you are not willing to go outside into your garden on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, in the lashings of rain, the reason you'd fall in love with a place like Inishmore, I've always said, is if you can see it on a grey day and still think it's magical, then you're halfway there. And it should be the same with your own garden. And that's ultimately what we try and do as a design practice. I think I'm probably up on time, and I'll leave you over to Aina. Thanks so much.